If you want to succeed at no limit Texas Hold'em cash games, you simply must stop making these 3 mistakes that I'm going to be sharing with you today. Poker right now is more popular than it has ever been. Here, the number of entrants in the World Series of Poker main event, as you see, the number keeps increasing. And this is translated to lots of small and medium stakes poker games in many poker rooms, especially in Las Vegas, being completely full with long waiting lists of people ready to get in there and test their skills. So now is the time for you to work hard to improve your poker skills so that you can take advantage of all of these players who are looking to get their gamble on in the 1-2 and 2-5 cash games live, and also in small and medium stakes games online, like on Coin Poker. And today, I'm going to share with you 3 things that you have to stop doing if you want to beat these games. You're going to be learning in this webinar how and when to 3-bet more often. Also, you're going to learn my number 1 cash game exploit. And finally, you're going to learn how to make big folds in spots where a lot of players get stacked because they think it's a cooler. So, mistake number 1 a lot of people make is to only 3-bet or re-raise before the flop with the nuts. What a lot of people do very wrong is they only re-raise with hands that they're really happy to get a lot of money in with, like pocket jacks and ace king. And if you do that, you're going to be easy to play against because your opponents will know when you have a strong hand, because you re-raise when you have a strong hand and you call when you don't. And essentially, what a lot of people do is they think that they have a big post-flop edge, therefore they can call with all sorts of junk, or at least medium strength hands, and this results in them leaving a lot of money on the table because a lot of these medium type hands would actually prefer to re-raise to win a lot of money in most poker games, assuming the rake is not gigantically big. You'd prefer to have a loose, aggressive image, whether or not you're actually playing overly loose and aggressive, because when your opponents think you're in there battling and trying to steal pots, that's going to result in you allowing to get paid off when you actually get a premium hand. Let's take a look at some game theory optimal pre-flop charts. Let's take a look at this one here. Here's how you should play 100 big blinds deep on the button versus a cutoff raise. The hands in red are re-raising, the hands in green are calling, the hands in blue are folding. I want to take a look at a few things here. First, what is re-raising? Well, aces, kings, queens, jacks, ace, king. These are just your best hands. And then some marginal hands, hands that are perhaps not quite good enough to call with or barely good enough to call with, like some suited aces, some suited kings, a few suited connected type hands, and then some offsuit high card hands like ace 10 offsuit, king queen offsuit, ace jack offsuit, king jack offsuit, queen jack offsuit, and ace queen offsuit some portion of the time. So notice you're re-raising with your best hands, which, makes a lot of sense. And then you're also re-raising with some hands that are just okay. That way your opponent does not definitively know when you re-raise that you have the nuts. Because if they know you have the nuts, you're going to be easy to play against. Now, take a look at what is calling. Well, it's all the hands kind of in between the hands that are re-raising for value and the hands that are re-raising as a bluff. So lots of suited aces as well, suited Broadway hands, pocket pairs, some suited connectors, and some offsuit high card hands. Now, what a lot of people do wrong in this spot is they call on the button far too often. Notice already 9-8 suited and 8-7 suited and 7-6 suited are mixing between calling and folding. And look, to be fair, if you wanted to call them every time or re-raise them at some portion of the time, I think that's fine. But notice hands like 10-7 suited, 9-6 suited, 8-5 suited, 9-8 offsuit, 8-7 offsuit, ace-8 offsuit, king-9 offsuit, queen-10 offsuit. All of these hands simply fold to the initial raise. When you're playing in a cash game where there is no ante in play and there is a rake in play, you really just don't get to splash around all that much. So you have to have discipline. I know a lot of your opponents in a lot of small stakes games will be calling raises with all sorts of nonsense, trying to flop well, but that is why they are stuck in the small stakes games. That's why they're not winning. Recognize that if you model your strategy after small stakes losers, well, you're probably going to be a small stakes loser, and that is not what I want for you. Let's take a look at another scenario. Here we have the big blind versus a button raise first in. So it folds around to the button, and they raise it up. What should you do in the big blind? Well, again, the hands in red are re-raising, hands in green are calling, hands in blue are folding. Let's take a look at the folds first. You should fold the weakest suited hands and a lot of offsuit hands. A lot of people are not folding the king-8 offsuit or 10-8 offsuit or 7-6 offsuit or the ace-2 offsuit in the big blind against a button raise. But you should in a cash game because you are deep stacked, out of position, there's going to be a rake taken out of the pot, You just don't get to mess around. Notice now, though, the re-raising range is a little bit different when you are out of position compared to when you're in position. When you're out of position, you're going to 3-bet way more linearly in general, which mainly means just a lot of your best hands. So we see now something like pocket eights and better re-raising a lot, ace jack suited and better, ace jack offsuit and better, lots of suited Broadway hands, and a few suited connectors. Okay? Notice now you're not re-raising the hands that are barely playable. You're re-raising hands that have generally more post-flop playability, because when you re-raise from out of position, you're more likely to get called by the player on the button. And in small stakes cash games, as your opponents are going to be more inclined to call with all sorts of nonsense, you should perhaps 3-bet even more linearly. So maybe you don't 3-bet the small suited connectors and the jack 7 suited type stuff. Instead, you just 3-bet something like ace 9 suited and better, ace 10 offsuit and better, and pocket 6s and better. Something like that, plus the suited Broadway hands. And I think that's going to be a pretty good strategy, because when you re-raise and your opponents call, they're pretty likely to be dominated. So that's mistake number 1. A lot of players only re-raise with their best hands, and that results in them being very, very predictable. And you don't want to be predictable in a way that's also very easy to play against. Mistake number 2 a lot of small stakes players make is that they do not check raise often enough. This is actually my number 1 small stakes cash game exploit. And the reason is simple. People continuation bet way too often in cash games. In game theory optimal world, you don't get to continuation bet 100% of the time on every single flop, which is what a lot of players do. And if you do continuation bet far too often, or your opponent's continuation bet far too often, they're going to have far too many bluffs / junky hands in their range. And if someone's range is far too weak, you punish them by check raising, especially when the board is good for your perceived range. Now, if the board is good for your opponent's perceived range, like let's say they raise from early position and you call in the big blind and the flop comes ace, king, queen, and you check and they bet, this is a spot that should be very good for them in general. And in that spot, you don't exploit them by raising more often, you exploit them by calling more often. But on boards that are good for your range, like middle card boards when you're in the big blind, that's when you really want to apply aggression by raising. Let's take a look at some examples. Here we have 9-8 suited. Low jack raises, folds around us on the big blind. We opt to call. Flop comes. Queen 7-5. We check. Opponent continuation bets small. This is a spot where, it's probably okay to continuation bet pretty often, but the low jack does need to be very careful. Uh-oh, my thing's off the board. Here we go. Let's reset this hand. Folds around to the low jack, they raise it up. We call in the big blind. There we go. Queen 7-5. We check the continuation bet small. If they continuation bet here every time, they are going to be continuation betting with a range that contains too many hands that just don't connect well with this flop, like king 10 suited, ace X, middle pairs that don't really love getting check raised. So this is a spot where when you have some sort of draw, whether it be a good draw like a flush draw or a junky draw like a gut shot straight draw, you are going to want to apply aggression. They make it $4. We make it $15. Put yourself in your opponent's shoes right here. Imagine you're sitting here with king jack. Well, you're going to fold. Imagine you have ace jack. You're going to fold. If you have pocket 4s, probably going to fold. If you have a pair, you're not going to fold. But recognize the board's going to get worse for the pairs a whole lot of the time on the turn in the river. So this is a spot where we can apply a lot of aggression. This time the opponent just folds. Let's take a look at another example. We're off the screen again. Oh boy. All right, we raise it up, or the cutoff raises it up to $6. We defend the jack 9 of hearts. Flop comes 8-6-4. This is a board that is excellent for the player in the big blind. You may say, should the big blind start leading? And the answer is no. When you're playing deep stacked poker, you do not get to lead from out of position very often at all. When you're shallow stacked in a tournament, you may start to develop some leads like we discussed thoroughly at pokercoaching.com. And you can see this in peakgto.com. But when you're playing deep stacked, you simply do not get to lead, assuming you're trying to play game theory optimal poker. So we check, and the opponent bets $4. Now, this is a spot where a lot of people just fold with their jack 9 of hearts because they think, I have jack high. I don't have a straight draw. I don't have a flush draw. So I'm going to fold. And that seems kind of logical. The problem, though, is that your opponent bet really small, and our jack 9 of hearts is deceptively good here. Notice any heart on the turn, or perhaps a 10, or a 7, or a queen. All of these are okay for us. Also, a jack or a 9 gives us top pair. So we have a lot of cards on the turn that give us good equity. So this is a great spot to put in a raise. We make it 15. Opponent calls. All right, now a lot of people think, okay, I'm just done with this unless I improve. And to be fair, sometimes you should be. But if you get a card that should be scary for your opponent's flop calling range, you're going to want to continue bluffing in those spots too. Here we get the 7. We have an open-ended straight draw now. Notice we could also easily have a 5, in which case the opponent's going to be drawing dead with a lot of their hands. And we could also have 10-9, right? 10-9 has the opponent drawing thin or dead as well. So this is a spot where we're definitely going to want to continue betting. The pot's $43. We go 25, half pot, with the idea we're probably going to be bluffing on a whole lot of rivers. This time the opponent simply lets it go. Now, what I want to show you here is what the opponent should do in this situation. The hands in green in their range call, the hands in red raise, and the hands in blue fold. Take a look at how many hands that are folding in the opponent's range that our Jack-9 loses to. Look, all the ace highs folding, all the king highs folding, all the queen highs folding, even hands like pocket queens and jacks are folding. Also, note some of these other hands that a lot of people will simply fold. Notice if the opponent has a hand like 9-7, second pair, gut shot straight draw. A lot of people are going to strongly consider folding in this spot. Notice if they have a hand like Queen 10 for just a gut shot and overcards. They're supposed to continue, but a lot of people will let that go. Also, take a look at these hands in red. These are the hands that should raise. So they're raising with some straights, which makes logical sense. But then a whole lot of junkers, right? Notice they're raising a lot of hands with a 9 and a 10. And this is something a lot of people simply do not do. Also notice pocket 3s down here is raising as a bluff. And that's something people don't do. So given your opponent is probably going to play way more cautiously than the game theory optimal strategy recommends, this is an even better spot to fight fire with fire and put in the check raise. So make sure you check raise at least as much as the game theory optimal strategy recommends against people who continuation bet too often. And in reality, you probably want to check raise even more often. Mistake number 3 is hero calling on the river. The goal when you're playing poker should be to make the most money as possible. It should not be to be right or to let your opponents know that you got outdrawn. Don't let your ego play poker. Your ego is your enemy. In small stakes cash games, for the most part, your opponents are simply not going to bluff anywhere near often enough on the river. So if someone's not going to bluff anywhere near often enough, you exploit that by never hero calling. Now, what is a hero call? Essentially, it's the spot where you're calling with a bluff catcher. A bluff catcher is a hand that loses to all of your opponent's value hands. Now, if your hand beats some of your opponent's value hands, that's not really a bluff catcher. That's a hand that is pretty good because it beats all the bluffs plus some value hands. But if you do have a bluff catcher that literally always loses to value hands and always beats bluffs, you should drastically overfold in small stakes cash games because most people do not bluff anywhere near often enough. Here we have the ace king. We raise it up to $6. Big blind calls. Flop comes king 10-5. They check. We continuation bet kind of big. They call. Turns to 10 of hearts and they check. This is a spot where a lot of people mess up and they check it back. They think, well, my opponent could easily have a 10. We have to recognize they could also easily have a king or a 5 or a draw. So it's probably a pretty good spot to continue betting. We go for the chunky bet to get full value from kings and to extract value from draws. And now the opponent raises. Right off the bat, I think folding in this spot against a lot of players, old man coffee who's over there literally playing only the nuts, I think this is a pretty reasonable spot to fold. In game theory optimal world, folding would be criminal. It'd be way too tight. So we're going to call in this scenario. But if your opponent is weak, tight, and passive, you might just want to let it go immediately. Rivers of 9. Opponent goes all in. Now at this point, a lot of people think, okay, I beat some bluffs. I'm getting pretty good pot odds. I only need to win 30 or 25% of the time to break even. So I should call. The problem, though, is that when the opponent check raises the turn and then blasts the river, and some of the draws come in, notice Queen Jack does come in, plus any 10 beats us, this is actually a fold in game theory optimal world. 100% of the time. So if you should fold this hand every time, if your opponent's playing perfectly, if your opponent is bluffing less often than perfectly, which I do think is going to be the case because a lot of people aren't going to take random flush draws and check raise them on the turn and then blast the river, or some sporadic, really optimistic bluffs and then blast them on the river. This is just a fold. An easy fold. Trivially easy fold. And yeah, they will bluff you some portion of the time. But more often than not, this is a spot where, look, I think folding the turn could be reasonable, but you should definitely fold on the river, especially when some of the draws come in. And right here, the queen jack came in. Let's take a look at another scenario. King 10 of hearts. Somebody raises, we call. Big blind. Flop comes. King queen 5. We check. The continuation bet. We call. Turns a jack. We check. The continuation bet. We call. River's a 5. We check. They pot it. What should we do in the situation with the king 10? Take a second. Think about it. While you're here, let me know in the comment section below what you think we should do with the king 10. And if you're enjoying today's video, click the like button, click the subscribe button, click the notification bell. If you really want to be helpful, go tell one of your friends about this video. All right. This is a spot where in Game Theory Optimal World, you should also find a fold. Sounds nitty, I know, but you have to realize in the spot when your opponent's raising from under the gun +1, their range should be very strong. And on top of that, your opponent's not going to find bluffs with random ace-x that have nothing, or perhaps small pairs that have essentially nothing, or junky suited connectors that maybe had like a gut shot on the turn or something that now have nothing. Your opponent's simply not going to find bluffs in the spot. And if they have a queen or a jack, they're probably going to check behind on the turn or not bet again on the river, right? So this is a spot where unless your opponent's absolutely maniacal, they're going to have you beat. And I realize in the spot it may be tempting to call because top pair is really good, right? But in GTO world, for the most part, you simply need to let it go in the spot because this board should be very good for the opponent's range. And unless they're finding lots and lots of bluffs that I don't think most small stakes players are finding, you have to let it go. And in Game Theory Optimal World, you should be folding about 80% of the time. And like I said, if your opponent is not bluffing anywhere near often enough, you should be folding every time with your bluff catchers. And a lot of people have trouble realizing that this king is just a bluff catcher here because your opponent probably isn't raising too many weaker kings from early position. And if they did, they may not even bet them on the flop and turn and river. And therefore, they have a better king or better to value bet flop, turn, and river. So even though we have top pair, it's good. It's just the bluff catcher. So fold your bluff catchers. So that is it. Those are 3 huge mistakes you need to stop making in low stakes cash games. To recap, number 1, stop 3-betting with only the nuts before the flop. Number 2, make sure you check raise adequately, especially against people who continuation bet too often, and especially on boards that should be good for your range. And number 3, stop hero calling on the river. Your opponents simply are not bluffing often enough. Good luck in your games. Have fun. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, let me know in the comments section down below. And get in there and crush the cash games.